Shalom, this is Levi Shore. Welcome back to Sweet and Good Torah. Tonight we're going to learn about Parsha Lech Lecha. We're going to see Avraham and Sarah. They're going to move to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. And we're going to take a look at a very interesting concept in the Torah tonight. We're going to take a look at the concept of Maisa Avos Siman Labanim. So the actions of the Avos. So what does that mean? The actions of Avraham and Sarah, Abraham and Sarah, the actions of Yitzhak and Rivka, Isaac and Rebekah, and the actions of Yaakov and Rachel and Leah, the actions of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, what they do in their lifetime echoes through all of Jewish history. So what they do is reflected in the Jewish history to come. So, for instance, we see that Avraham and Sarah, they go down to Egypt and they have this confrontation with the Pharaoh, and he captures Sarah. And then Hashem brings plagues on the Pharaoh. And we see, of course, when the Jewish people go down then as a whole family, and then we have the 210 years of slavery in Egypt. So the pattern set by Abraham, and then we see the pattern of the Jewish people. So we're going to see something very fascinating, because in the Hebrew calendar, which starts from the creation of the world, and then it starts to count from the creation of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, up till now. So now we're in the year 5786, which we just started this Rosh Hashanah. And there's a very interesting parallel. So currently we're using the Roman calendar. And what's fascinating about that is King Herod, he died in the year 0. And then his kingdom was divided between his sons. But at that point, the Roman Empire really stepped in and started controlling Israel, and we lost autonomous rule. And you'll see that the dates, they really line up, and there's great parallels between the Hebrew calendar in the days of Abraham and our current Roman calendar, and it's really incredible when you start to take a look at it. So let me bring this up on the screen here, and we'll take a look at some of the really fascinating parallels. So one thing really just jumps out at you. So in 1948, so 1,948 years after the creation of Adam, we see that Abraham is born in Kufa, and it's west, I believe, of Ur Kasdim, and this is in modern-day Iraq. And the world he lived in was Nimrod, as we saw back in Parsha. Noach was the first king, and he really used the fear of the flood to get control over all the people of the world, and he convinced them to move back down, to the valley of Shinar in modern-day Iraq, because they were all scared and they were living in the mountains. And then Nimrod, he was in charge of the plan of building the Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, and then he became the first king. So born into this, environment, and I believe, let's see, Abraham, if I do my math correctly, the tower was built in 1996, so we'll get to it soon, but I believe Abraham would have been, I think, 52 when they were building the tower, and he didn't take part of it. So Abraham's father, Terach, so he was an idol worshiper. And not only was he an idol worshiper, he was very, very wealthy, because he was the main supplier of idols to King Nimrod. So he was very high up in that society, and he was very, very wealthy, and he was the royal idol maker and salesman. And then Abraham's brothers are Nachor and Haran. So we see the obvious parallel. So then in our Roman calendar, the Golas, Edom, the Roman exile, 1948, there's an obvious parallel. So just as Abraham was born in 1948, the state of Israel is born in 1948, and the Balfour Declaration, took place in 1917. The British Empire was very powerful at the time, and they promised, Lord Balfour was close, I believe, to, I think it was Lionel Rothschild, and there was also Benjamin Disraeli, who was prime minister, and he was Jewish, so there's a lot in the works that Hashem had going on. And the British Empire gave the state of Israel, or the land, to the Jewish people, and then it was kind of split. Originally, I think the declaration gave the Jewish people, what's currently the state of Israel, and then the nation of Jordan. That was all supposed to be that, and then it got split, and the Arabs started rising up, and then I think the British Empire gave the modern state of Jordan to the Arabs, and then split it, the Jews, on the Israel side, and then, of course, you see all the tensions and terrorist attacks and intifadas of the Arabs living in Israel, and it all started in 1948. Okay, so the next big date is 1958, and this is when Sarah, she's born to the brother of Terah, I'm sorry, the brother of Abraham, Haran. So that would make her, I think, so she was Abraham's niece. And she was originally called Yiska. That was her given name. And she was very, very beautiful. And I mean, the Gemara says she was one of the most beautiful women that ever lived. And back in the ancient world, it was very different from now. Um, the way the person's neshama was, their inner quality, who they were spiritually, was reflected on their outside. So now someone could be very beautiful and could be not so great spiritually on the inside, or someone could be not as attractive and be, just tremendously great spiritually. But back in the ancient world, it was a complete reflection of their spiritual, character. So if they were spiritually great, they were beautiful. So her brother was Lot, and they were orphaned because it's very interesting. We're going to see soon that Abraham, when he starts smashing the idols, which is, that's where we get the word iconoclast, that he was thrown into the furnace by Nimrod and he was miraculously saved. And then his brother, we'll see, was kind of on the fence, and Haran was killed. So Lot and Sarah, they were orphans. So then at 40, there's different midrashim. Some say when Abraham was just 3 years old, he was studying nature, he was studying the patterns of the world. But in this one midrash, it says when he was 40 years old, so in 1958, that's when he recognized that Hashem's, the one infinite being, the one infinite creator, the one infinite God. I couldn't find like maybe an exact parallel, and I have to keep working on this. But it was interesting because in 1958, right, we had these alliances. We have Egypt and Syria forming the United Arab Republic, and Iraq and Jordan unite in the Arab Federation. And we're going to see in the wars to come that this is very important. Okay, so then 1973, interesting. So this is kind of like almost the opposite situation, but 1973, Abraham marries Sarah, and they really, there's been no married couple that's changed the world as much as they have, maybe with the exception of Moshe, Moses, and Zipporah. I mean, but they changed the world dramatically. And it's amazing. Every major religion now is from Abraham. So Abraham gives birth to Yitzhak, and then Yitzhak, to Yaakov, and then the Jewish people are formed from that. Then Abraham's son Ishmael goes on to form the Arab nations and Islam. And then his grandson Asa forms Edom, which becomes the Roman Empire and Christianity. And then, interestingly enough, Avram and his first the servant of Sarah, Hagar, who was actually the princess of Egypt. She was given to Abraham when they went down to Egypt. And after Sarah was released, Hagar was given to be a maidservant to Sarah, and she was actually the princess. So Hagar was actually the Egyptian princess. And then Abraham marries Hagar, and they have Ishmael. And then he remarries Hagar later after Sarah dies, and now she's given the name Keturah. And they sent their sons to the east, the Bnei Kedem, and I believe this is the Brahmin the Brahmin priest, the very ancient Hindu, the beginnings of Hinduism. And I believe it's interesting because one of the original gods they worship was Brahma and Swati, I think. So it means beautiful Sarah. So it's very interesting. So Brahma, I think, is like some kind of word of Avram, his original name. So Brahma and Saraswati, the beautiful Sarah. And I think somehow they got, he got corrupted into Avodah Zarah. But I think he gave the teachings to his sons, and that was the original Brahmin priest in India. And so it's very interesting. So, and then out of course, Hinduism comes Buddhism. So you're talking about all the major religions basically are all coming out from Abraham. It's very fascinating. So here in 1973 of our calendar, we have kind of the opposite of a marriage. We have the Yom Kippur War. Interesting thought. On October the 6th, it began, and we're going to see October 6th, 7th is just going to be again and again and again. That lasted until October the 25th, and it was a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria. Okay, then very interesting parallel here. In 1996, the Hebrew calendar, the Tower of Babel, the construction was ended because Hashem split all of them into the 70 nations and 70 different languages. But until that point, they all spoke Lashon HaKodesh. They all spoke the Hebrew tongue, they spoke Hebrew. I mean, the Holy Tongue, they spoke Hebrew. And then Hashem split them into 70 nations and split them into 70 languages. So, what's really fascinating here in this parallel, so in 1996, this is when the internet was publicly released. And now it seems that Hashem is now bringing everyone back together. So then we have inventions like Google Translate, but now you can talk to anyone in the world from any nation. And it seems that in 1996, the Hebrew calendar, Hashem splits everyone, and now Hashem's bringing everyone back together. And I think it's like we're getting ready for the coming of Mashiach. Okay, so then 2000, this is when Avraham began to destroy Terach's idols. And it's a very funny story. Terach went away, and Avraham was in charge of the store, and he had he smashed all the idols except for the big one, and he puts an axe in the biggest idol's hands. And the father comes back, and he's furious, like all the idols are smashed. And Avraham said, "No, the big one was jealous of all the rest of them, and he smashed all the idols." And his father says, "Well, it's just a lifeless, rock. This idol couldn't destroy all the other idols." And he says, "Then why do you worship it? Why do you give anything to this idol, when it's just a lifeless rock?" So it's very interesting. That began, Abraham's Vayikra b'Shem Hashem, calling out in the name of Hashem, teaching the world Torah, and just changing the whole history of the world. And then this infuriated King Nimrod, and he put Abraham in the furnace, and then Abraham was miraculously saved. So interesting parallel here. I don't know exactly how it lines up, but 2000 was the Y2K. Everyone thought all the computers were going to crash. And then interestingly, or not so interestingly, there was an October 7th attack here. This was Hezbollah coming across the border. And unfortunately, we saw like the beginning of these horrible October the 7th attacks. And they abducted 3 IDF soldiers. And it's just, I don't know, you see this Yom Kippur War, October the 6th, this Hezbollah attack, October the 7th, and then the horrible October the 7th that's coming. So it's just this weird parallel that starts to emerge. All right, 2006, very interesting. So this was the first World War. So Sodom and Gomorrah, it's called Amorah in the Torah. They rebel against King Kedar Laomer. I believe King Kedar Laomer was in a alliance. There was 4 kings, and they represent the 4 great empires. One represents Babylon, one represents Persia, one represents Greece, and one represents Rome. And so they're in an alliance. They're eventually going to be in a war against the 5 kings of Sodom and Amorah. So in 2006, again, so that's the beginning of a war. It was a rebellion there. And then 2006 was the Israel-Lebanon war. So I was actually there in Israel for this. And it was the 12th of July to the 8th of September. And it was the war with Hezbollah. Right, so in 2021, this is now the first World War. So it's the war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. As I just said, the 4 kings represent the 4 great empires of history against the 5 kings around the Sodom area. So that's around the current area of the Dead Sea. So now it's a cursed, salted area. But back in the ancient world, it was very rich. The waters of the Dead Sea were clear, not salty like they are now. And it was very fertile, very rich, and it was a very, very wealthy area. And these 5 kings were amazingly wealthy. And unfortunately, their great wealth made them very corrupt. So in 2021, we had something called the Israel-Palestine Unity Intifada. So there was first Intifada, second Intifada. I think there's almost like a third Intifada. And so we see war. 2023. So this is a very interesting year. So this was actually the Bris Bein Basarim. This is when Abraham makes the covenant with Hashem. This is now becomes the covenant that's reaffirmed, to the whole Jewish people. And Abraham asked the famous question, Ma Yeda, how do I know my children are going to inherit the land? What if Chas v'Shalom, they don't follow your Torah? And Hashem says, no, they will inherit the land. And the proof is that they're going to go into exile. And then shortly after, in the life of Yaakov, Jacob, we go into the Egyptian exile. And then we have the 4 exiles for the empires I talked about, the Babylonian exile, the Persian exile, and that's the famous story of, the Megillah. So we had the days of Mordecai and Esther against the Achashverosh and the wicked Haman. And then the Greek Empire, the Greek exile with Alexander the Great. He begins that empire, and then we're coming up to Hanukkah, and that's the war against one of the Greek kings that was in Syria, Antiochus. And right, and then into our long Golus Edom, our long 2025 years of our current Roman exile. And then, unfortunately, right, 2023, October the 7th, attacked by Hamas. 1,195 Jews were killed in the attack. 250 Jews were kidnapped into Gaza. And after 2 years of fighting, it's been horrible. And there's been many Israeli soldiers, the IDF soldiers that have been killed, and many have been wounded. And it's just horrible. But if there's a positive take out of it all, it's very interesting because the word tov in Lashon HaKodesh, good, is the gematria, the numerical value of 17. And it's very interesting. If you add 10, 7, October the 7th, it's 17. So even though this is a great tragedy, there's going to be great good that's going to come out of it. And we see like many Jews like returning to Hashem, returning to the Torah, and more unity is beginning to happen. I know there's still a lot of tension, and there is the big issue with like pulling out the students from yeshiva into the army. So there is a lot of tension, but it started the October the 7th attack. It started to bring us together. It's starting the healing and starting us back into unity. Oh, so then we go into the future. So this is probably going to carry us into the days of Mashiach. So 2048 is when Abraham was 100. He circumcised himself, and Yitzhak was born on Pesach, on Passover, on the 15th of Nisan. 2061, that's when Abraham sends Yishmael and Hagar away. And that could be Mashiach ben David, finally redeeming the land from the children of Yishmael. And then 2084, so all this, we in the future, Avram takes Yitzhak to the Akedah, and he's prepared to sacrifice Yitzhak, and and Avram passes his 10 trials, and the Jewish people in the days of Mashiach will also be given 10 trials, and we will be victorious. All right, I think it's very interesting. I had to do more work on it, but I think there's some interesting parallels there. Let me know, what you think, your comments, or if you know any other big historical events that would fit into this. And, like, share, subscribe, all the good stuff. I hope to see you back again soon on Sweet and Good Torah.